Donald Trump and Joe Biden represent two vastly different political ideologies, leadership styles, and visions for the United States. Trump's approach is rooted in nationalism, economic deregulation, and a focus on American sovereignty. His policies emphasize reducing government intervention, prioritizing domestic industries, and enforcing stricter immigration laws. His leadership style is direct, often confrontational, and focused on disrupting the political establishment. He believes in strong executive action, frequently using executive orders to push policies forward. His supporters see him as a political outsider who challenges the status quo, fights against bureaucratic inefficiency, and stands firm on issues of national security and economic independence. Critics argue that his approach is divisive, undermines democratic institutions, and prioritizes short-term political gains over long-term stability. Biden's political philosophy centers on institutional governance, social equity, and international cooperation. His policies advocate for expanding government programs, increasing taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and strengthening social safety nets. He believes in diplomacy and alliance building as key components of American leadership on the global stage. His leadership style is more traditional, relying on bipartisan efforts where possible and seeking to restore norms in political discourse. His supporters view him as a stabilizing force who values experience, listens to expert opinions, and works toward long-term solutions to economic and social issues. Critics argue that his policies increase government dependency, contribute to economic stagnation, and failed to address national security concerns with the urgency required. Trump's presidency was marked by a focus on deregulation, tax cuts, and a tough on-trade stance, particularly against China. His America First policy aimed to prioritize domestic manufacturing and reduce reliance on foreign markets. His administration pushed for stricter immigration policies, including border security measures and travel bans. His supporters credit him with reshaping the conservative movement and prioritizing American workers. His critics claim that his policies increased wealth inequality and alienated key global allies. Biden's presidency emphasizes government intervention in economic recovery, social justice initiatives, and environmental policies. His administration has pursued infrastructure investments, climate change legislation, and healthcare expansion. He seeks to strengthen alliances through international agreements and a return to multilateralism. His supporters argue that his leadership focuses on long-term national progress, while his critics claim that his policies risk overregulation, higher taxation, and economic inefficiencies. Their contrasting visions continue to define the political landscape, shaping policy debates and national discourse. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have fundamentally different approaches to economic policy, reflecting their contrasting ideologies and governing styles. Trump's economic philosophy is centered on deregulation, tax cuts, and a free market approach that prioritizes business growth and private sector expansion. His administration implemented significant corporate tax cuts, reduced federal regulations, and promoted energy independence through increased domestic production. He believed in reducing government intervention in markets, arguing that lower taxes and fewer restrictions would stimulate job creation, increase wages, and encourage investment. His supporters credit him with fostering a strong pre-pandemic economy, record low unemployment rates, and a booming stock market. Critics argue that his policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy, widened economic inequality, and increased the national deficit. Biden's economic policies focus on government intervention, social spending, and progressive taxation to promote economic stability and reduce wealth disparities. His administration has prioritized infrastructure investments, expanded healthcare access, and promoted clean energy initiatives to create jobs and modernize the economy. He advocates for higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy to fund public services, arguing that a more equitable distribution of wealth leads to broader economic stability. His supporters see his approach as necessary for addressing systemic inequalities, improving social mobility, and ensuring long-term economic resilience. Critics claim that his policies discourage private sector growth, increase government dependency, and contribute to inflationary pressures. Trump's trade policies emphasized protecting American industries through tariffs and renegotiating trade agreements. He pursued aggressive economic policies against China, arguing that unfair trade practices hurt American businesses and workers. His administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, and implemented tariffs to encourage domestic production. Supporters view these measures as a necessary stand against foreign economic threats, while critics argue that tariffs led to higher consumer prices and retaliatory measures that harmed American exporters. Biden has taken a more multilateral approach to trade, emphasizing global cooperation while maintaining a focus on domestic job creation. His administration has worked to strengthen alliances with traditional trade partners while addressing economic challenges through diplomacy rather than unilateral tariffs. Supporters argue that his policies restore stability in global markets and improve long-term trade relationships. Critics contend that his approach lacks the assertiveness needed to counter economic competition from nations like China. Their differing economic philosophies continue to shape national policy, impacting businesses, workers, and global trade dynamics. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have distinct leadership styles that define their approaches to governance, crisis management, and public engagement. Trump's leadership is characterized by boldness, unpredictability, and a focus on direct communication with the public. He relies heavily on his personal brand, using social media, large rallies, and unscripted remarks to connect with his base. His style is confrontational and often challenges political norms, portraying himself as an outsider willing to disrupt the establishment. He emphasizes strength and decisiveness, often making quick decisions and prioritizing immediate impact over bureaucratic processes. His supporters admire his willingness to challenge institutions, push back against the media, and take an aggressive stance on policy issues. Critics argue that his impulsive nature, disregard for expert advice, and polarizing rhetoric create instability and division. Biden's leadership style is more traditional, measured, and focused on coalition building. He values expert consultation, structured policy making, and institutional stability. His approach to leadership emphasizes diplomacy, unity, and patience in decision-making. He seeks to restore faith in government institutions by adhering to established norms, working within the legislative system, and emphasizing bipartisan efforts when possible. His supporters appreciate his ability to navigate complex political challenges with a steady hand, listen to diverse perspectives, and govern with empathy. Critics argue that his leadership can be slow, overly cautious, and lacking the boldness needed to address urgent national and global challenges. Trump's leadership thrives on dominating the political narrative, often using media and direct engagement to control public discourse. He frames issues in terms of victories and losses, positioning himself as a champion of the people against the establishment. His leadership appeals to those who favor a strong, authoritative figure who challenges conventional politics. His critics contend that his reliance on media spectacle and personal branding overshadows substantive policymaking and contributes to national division. Biden's leadership relies on structured governance, institutional processes, and policy-driven decision-making. He prioritizes legislative solutions, expert recommendations, and diplomacy over confrontational politics. His leadership resonates with those who value experience, stability, and traditional governance methods. Critics claim that his style lacks urgency and that his efforts to build consensus can lead to slow or diluted policy outcomes. Their contrasting leadership styles continue to shape their political influence, with Trump embodying a disruptive populist approach and Biden representing a steady institutional approach to governance. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have fundamentally different approaches to foreign policy, shaped by their perspectives on American leadership, global alliances, and national security. Trump's foreign policy is based on nationalism, prioritizing American interests over multilateral agreements. His America First doctrine emphasizes economic self-sufficiency, reducing international commitments, and renegotiating trade deals to benefit the U.S. He withdrew from global agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, arguing that they unfairly disadvantaged American industries and security. He engaged in direct diplomacy with adversaries such as North Korea, seeking high-profile summits and unconventional negotiations. Supporters see his approach as bold and pragmatic, asserting American strength and reducing reliance on global institutions. Critics argue that his unpredictability weakened international alliances and created instability in global diplomacy. Biden's foreign policy is centered on rebuilding alliances, reestablishing U.S. credibility, and engaging in multilateral cooperation. His administration emphasizes working with NATO, the United Nations, and traditional allies to address global challenges. He rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, reaffirmed commitments to international agreements, and focused on diplomacy in handling tensions with adversaries. He believes in a rules-based global order where alliances and collective decision-making strengthen national security and economic stability. Supporters view his approach as restoring global trust in American leadership and reinforcing long-term strategic partnerships. Critics contend that his foreign policy is too cautious, lacks strong deterrence against adversaries, and risks entangling the U.S. in prolonged diplomatic engagements without clear benefits. Trump's handling of international conflicts focused on military deterrence and economic pressure rather than prolonged interventions. He pushed for NATO allies to increase their defense spending, implemented tariffs on China to counter trade imbalances, and used sanctions as a primary tool against adversarial nations. His supporters credit him with keeping America out of new wars and confronting global threats through economic leverage. Critics argue that his approach alienated allies and reduced American influence in diplomatic negotiations. Biden's approach to global conflicts emphasizes coalition building and diplomatic resolutions. His administration coordinated responses to Russian aggression in Ukraine, strengthened alliances in the Indo-Pacific to counter China's influence, and focused on humanitarian aid and global stability. Supporters argue that his leadership reinforces global cooperation and responsible engagement. Critics claim that his response to crises, such as the Afghanistan withdrawal, demonstrated weakness and poor planning. Their contrasting foreign policy philosophies continue to define their political identities, influencing America's role on the world stage.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden have contrasting approaches to immigration policy, reflecting their broader views on national security, economic priorities, and social integration. Trump's immigration stance is centered on strict border control, enforcement of existing laws, and reducing both legal and illegal immigration. His administration implemented policies such as the construction of a border wall, the Remain in Mexico program, and travel bans on certain countries. He prioritized deportations and sought to limit pathways to citizenship, arguing that a strong immigration policy protects American workers, prevents crime, and secures the nation's borders. Supporters see his policies as necessary to preserve national sovereignty and uphold the rule of law. Critics argue that his approach is overly harsh, inhumane, and undermines America's historical role as a nation of immigrants. Biden's immigration policy focuses on reforming the system, providing legal pathways to citizenship, and addressing the root causes of migration. His administration has sought to undo many of Trump's restrictive policies, reinstating protections for DACA recipients, reducing deportations of non-criminal immigrants, and advocating for comprehensive immigration reform. He emphasizes humanitarian approaches, expanding asylum programs, and addressing economic and political instability in migrants' home countries. Supporters see his approach as compassionate, modern, and aligned with America's values. Critics argue that his policies encourage illegal immigration, overburden public resources, and fail to secure the border effectively. Trump's focus on immigration enforcement led to policies that aimed to deter illegal crossings, including family separations and increased use of detention facilities. His administration also sought to limit legal immigration through visa restrictions and increased scrutiny of asylum claims. His supporters argue that these measures were necessary to reduce crime, prevent economic strain, and prioritize American citizens. His critics contend that these policies led to humanitarian crises, international condemnation, and legal challenges. Biden's immigration approach includes efforts to streamline legal immigration processes and provide pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants already in the country. His administration has worked to expand work visas, improve border processing, and advocate for bipartisan immigration reform. Supporters argue that his policies offer fair and humane solutions to long-standing issues within the immigration system. Critics claim that his approach is too lenient, fails to deter illegal crossings, and creates challenges in border security management. Their differing policies reflect broader ideological divides, influencing national debates on security, labor markets, and humanitarian responsibilities. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have opposing views on healthcare policy, reflecting their broader political philosophies regarding government involvement, regulation, and access to medical services. Trump's approach to healthcare focused on reducing government intervention, promoting private sector solutions, and repealing the Affordable Care Act, ACA. His administration sought to dismantle key aspects of the ACA, arguing that it increased costs, limited choices, and placed an undue burden on taxpayers. He supported expanding health savings accounts, reducing prescription drug prices through market competition, and allowing states more flexibility in administering Medicaid. His supporters believe his policies encouraged innovation, reduced unnecessary regulations, and empowered individuals to make their own healthcare choices. Critics argue that his efforts to weaken the ACA threatened coverage for millions and failed to provide a comprehensive alternative. Biden's healthcare policy prioritizes expanding government involvement to increase access, affordability, and quality of care. His administration has worked to strengthen and expand the ACA, increase subsidies for lower-income families, and introduce policies aimed at reducing prescription drug prices through government negotiation. He advocates for a public health insurance option, allowing more Americans to access government-backed insurance without eliminating private options. His supporters argue that his approach ensures health care is a fundamental right, reduces disparities, and improves long-term health outcomes. Critics contend that his policies increase government control, raise healthcare costs through higher taxes, and reduce competition in the insurance market. Trump's administration focused on deregulating the healthcare industry, emphasizing free market competition to drive down prices and improve services. He sought to lower drug prices through executive orders, increase transparency in hospital pricing, and expand short-term insurance plans. Supporters credit him with making healthcare more consumer-friendly and reducing bureaucracy. Critics argue that his approach benefited corporations over individuals and failed to address systemic issues in coverage and affordability. Biden's administration has worked to expand Medicaid coverage, implement policies to cap prescription drug costs, and increase funding for rural healthcare programs. His administration's COVID-19 response focused on vaccine distribution, public health initiatives, and strengthening pandemic preparedness. Supporters view his approach as pragmatic and necessary for a functioning healthcare system. Critics claim that his policies increase federal spending, discourage private sector innovation, and risk long-term sustainability. Their differing healthcare philosophies continue to shape national debates, influencing public policy and discussions on the future of medical care in the United States. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have distinct approaches to taxation and fiscal policy, reflecting their broader economic philosophies. Trump's policies prioritize tax cuts, deregulation, and incentives for businesses to stimulate economic growth. His administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which significantly reduced corporate tax rates and lowered individual tax brackets. He argued that lower taxes increase investment, create jobs, and allow businesses to expand, ultimately benefiting the economy. His supporters believe that his tax policies led to record low unemployment, wage growth, and a booming stock market before the pandemic. Critics contend that his tax cuts primarily benefited the wealthy and corporations while contributing to an increase in the national deficit. Biden's approach to taxation focuses on increasing government revenue to fund social programs, infrastructure, and healthcare initiatives. He supports raising taxes on corporations and high-income earners while maintaining lower tax rates for middle and lower-income Americans. His administration has proposed a global minimum tax for multinational corporations, seeking to prevent tax avoidance and ensure businesses contribute fairly. Supporters argue that his tax policies promote economic fairness, reduce income inequality, and generate funding for essential public services. Critics claim that higher taxes discourage investment, slow job growth, and burden businesses, leading to economic stagnation. Trump's fiscal strategy emphasized reducing government regulation and encouraging private sector growth through tax incentives. He promoted policies such as opportunity zones to drive investment in economically distressed areas and sought to repeal estate taxes to support generational wealth transfer. Supporters credit him with fostering a business-friendly environment that encouraged entrepreneurship and economic expansion. Critics argue that his policies widened the wealth gap and placed a higher tax burden on the middle class over time. Biden's fiscal policies prioritize funding social programs, improving public infrastructure, and expanding access to education and healthcare through targeted taxation. His administration has emphasized deficit reduction through increased revenue rather than spending cuts, arguing that strategic government investment strengthens long-term economic stability. Supporters view his approach as necessary for a balanced economy and social progress. Critics warn that higher taxes and increased government spending could lead to inflation, slow economic growth, and discourage business expansion. Their contrasting fiscal policies continue to shape economic debates, influencing tax legislation, business strategies, and federal budget decisions. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have fundamentally different approaches to climate change and environmental policy, reflecting their broader economic and political priorities. Trump's policies prioritized energy independence, deregulation, and reducing environmental restrictions on businesses. His administration rolled back numerous environmental regulations, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, and promoted fossil fuel production, including expanding oil drilling and coal mining. He argued that strict environmental policies hinder economic growth, reduce job opportunities, and place unnecessary burdens on American industries. His supporters credit him with reducing bureaucratic red tape, strengthening domestic energy production, and lowering energy costs. Critics contend that his policies ignored scientific consensus, exacerbated environmental degradation, and set back global efforts to combat climate change. Biden's environmental policies focus on climate action, renewable energy investment, and reestablishing the U.S. as a leader in global climate initiative. His administration rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, set ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions, and pushed for significant investments in clean energy infrastructure. He advocates for transitioning to renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, while implementing regulations to reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. His supporters argue that his policies create sustainable jobs, address the long-term risks of climate change, and position the U.S. as a leader in green technology. Critics claim that his approach places excessive restrictions on businesses, increases energy costs, and risks economic disruptions in fossil fuel-dependent regions. Trump's administration focused on reducing the influence of environmental regulations in industries such as manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation. He promoted the expansion of oil pipelines, reduced vehicle emission standards, and rolled back protections for public lands to allow for development. Supporters argue that these policies encouraged economic growth and strengthened American energy independence. Critics argue that they prioritized short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability. Biden's policies emphasize balancing environmental protection with economic growth through investments in clean energy jobs and sustainable infrastructure. His administration has supported electric vehicle production, clean energy tax credits, and carbon reduction initiatives. Supporters believe that his policies position the U.S. for future economic growth while addressing climate challenges. Critics argue that the transition away from fossil fuels is costly, disrupts traditional industries, and places financial burdens on consumers and businesses. Their opposing views on environmental policy continue to shape debates on energy, economic development, and climate responsibility at both national and global levels.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden have sharply contrasting views on law enforcement, criminal justice, and public safety, reflecting their broader political ideologies. Trump's approach emphasizes a strong law and order stance, supporting police departments, stricter penalties for crime, and tougher immigration enforcement. His administration advocated for policies that increased funding for law enforcement, cracked down on violent crime, and opposed efforts to reduce policing budgets. He positioned himself as a defender of police officers, arguing that crime surges were due to lenient policies and anti-police sentiment. His supporters view his policies as necessary to maintain public safety, deter criminal activity, and support law enforcement personnel. Critics argue that his rhetoric often inflamed tensions, dismissed concerns about systemic issues in policing, and overlooked the need for criminal justice reform. Biden's approach to criminal justice focuses on police reform, reducing mass incarceration, and addressing systemic inequalities in the legal system. His administration has supported funding for community-based policing, efforts to reduce excessive sentencing, and initiatives aimed at preventing crime through social programs. He has pushed for reforms that include banning chokeholds, increasing accountability for police misconduct, and investing in rehabilitation programs. His supporters believe his policies promote fairness, reduce racial disparities in the justice system, and modernize policing for a more effective and just system. Critics argue that his stance is too lenient, weakens law enforcement, and emboldens criminals, leading to higher crime rates. Trump's administration prioritized aggressive prosecution policies, reinstating federal use of the death penalty and discouraging early release programs. He frequently criticized movements like defunding the police, arguing that reducing law enforcement resources would lead to increased crime and public disorder. Supporters credit him with restoring law and order and standing against policies they view as weakening the justice system. Critics contend that his approach neglected the root causes of crime and relied too heavily on punitive measures without addressing rehabilitation or community relations. Biden has supported criminal justice policies that focus on reforming sentencing laws, eliminating private prisons, and reducing mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenders. His administration emphasizes a balance between supporting law enforcement and implementing reforms that prevent police abuses. Supporters argue that his policies create a more just and equitable system while still addressing public safety. Critics claim that his reforms risk undermining law enforcement's ability to effectively combat crime. Their differing approaches continue to influence national discussions on policing, crime prevention, and justice system fairness.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden have sharply contrasting views on law enforcement, criminal justice, and public safety, reflecting their broader political ideologies. Trump's approach emphasizes a strong law and order stance, supporting police departments, stricter penalties for crime, and tougher immigration enforcement. His administration advocated for policies that increased funding for law enforcement, cracked down on violent crime, and opposed efforts to reduce policing budgets. He positioned himself as a defender of police officers, arguing that crime surges were due to lenient policies and anti-police sentiment. His supporters view his policies as necessary to maintain public safety, deter criminal activity, and support law enforcement personnel. Critics argue that his rhetoric often inflamed tensions, dismissed concerns about systemic issues in policing, and overlooked the need for criminal justice reform. Biden's approach to criminal justice focuses on police reform, reducing mass incarceration, and addressing systemic inequalities in the legal system. His administration has supported funding for community-based policing, efforts to reduce excessive sentencing, and initiatives aimed at preventing crime through social programs. He has pushed for reforms that include banning chokeholds, increasing accountability for police misconduct, and investing in rehabilitation programs. His supporters believe his policies promote fairness, reduce racial disparities in the justice system, and modernize policing for a more effective and just system. Critics argue that his stance is too lenient, weakens law enforcement, and emboldens criminals, leading to higher crime rates. Trump's administration prioritized aggressive prosecution policies, reinstating federal use of the death penalty, and discouraging early release programs. He frequently criticized movements like defunding the police, arguing that reducing law enforcement resources would lead to increased crime and public disorder. Supporters credit him with restoring law and order and standing against policies they view as weakening the justice system. Critics contend that his approach neglected the root causes of crime and relied too heavily on punitive measures without addressing rehabilitation or community relations. Biden has supported criminal justice policies that focus on reforming sentencing laws, eliminating private prisons, and reducing mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenders. His administration emphasizes a balance between supporting law enforcement and implementing reforms that prevent police abuses. Supporters argue that his policies create a more just and equitable system while still addressing public safety. Critics claim that his reforms risk undermining law enforcement's ability to effectively combat crime. Their differing approaches continue to influence national discussions on policing, crime prevention, and justice system fairness. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have contrasting perspectives on gun control and Second Amendment rights, reflecting their broader views on individual freedoms, public safety, and government regulation. Trump's stance strongly supports gun rights, emphasizing the importance of the Second Amendment as a safeguard against government overreach and a fundamental aspect of American freedom. His administration opposed restrictive gun control measures and worked to expand gun ownership rights, including appointing pro-Second Amendment judges and reversing regulations that limited firearm access. He argued that law-abiding citizens should have the right to protect themselves without excessive government interference. His supporters believe his policies uphold constitutional rights, empower self-defense, and prevent government overreach. Critics contend that his approach ignores the risks of widespread firearm access and fails to address gun violence effectively. Biden advocates for stronger gun control measures, including universal background checks, assault weapon bans, and restrictions on high-capacity magazines. His administration has pushed for red flag laws, which allow law enforcement to temporarily remove firearms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others. He argues that stricter regulations are necessary to reduce gun violence, prevent mass shootings, and protect communities. His supporters believe his policies promote public safety, reduce preventable deaths, and implement common sense reforms without infringing on responsible gun ownership. Critics argue that his approach restricts constitutional rights, unfairly punishes law-abiding gun owners, and does little to address the root causes of crime. Trump's administration focused on protecting gun manufacturers from liability, rolling back restrictions on firearm accessories, and ensuring that federal agencies did not impose regulations that could limit gun ownership. He opposed bans on assault weapons, arguing that such measures were ineffective and infringed on personal freedoms. Supporters credit him with defending American gun rights and preventing restrictive legislation that they see as unconstitutional. Critics argue that his policies contributed to rising gun violence and ignored the need for preventive measures. Biden's administration has worked to implement gun violence prevention strategies through executive actions and legislative proposals, focusing on closing loopholes in gun sales, increasing penalties for illegal firearm trafficking, and expanding background check requirements. Supporters believe his policies balance responsible gun ownership with necessary public safety measures. Critics claim that his approach disproportionately affects law-abiding citizens while failing to curb crime driven by illegal firearms. Their differing views on gun control continue to shape national debates on public safety, constitutional rights, and the role of government in regulating firearms. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have opposing views on foreign policy, shaped by their differing approaches to diplomacy, military strategy, and global alliances. Trump's foreign policy follows an America First approach, prioritizing national interests, economic independence, and reducing international commitments. His administration focused on renegotiating trade deals, withdrawing from multilateral agreements, and pressuring allies to contribute more to defense spending. He sought to strengthen U.S. sovereignty by reducing reliance on global institutions and prioritizing bilateral agreements over multinational coalitions. Supporters argue that his policies reinforced American strength, demanded fair treatment in trade and security agreements, and put national interests above globalist agendas. Critics contend that his approach alienated allies, weakened international partnerships, and reduced American influence on the world stage. Biden's foreign policy emphasizes restoring alliances, multilateral cooperation, and reasserting American leadership in global affairs. His administration has prioritized rebuilding relationships with NATO, rejoining international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord, and working closely with democratic nations to address global challenges. He advocates for diplomacy-first strategies, using international institutions to manage conflicts and promote stability. Supporters argue that his approach strengthens global partnerships, enhances national security through cooperation, and improves America's standing in the world. Critics claim that his policies prioritize international concerns over domestic interests, increase dependence on global institutions, and fail to project strength against adversarial nations. But Trump's administration focused on reshaping trade relations, particularly with China, imposing tariffs to address what he described as unfair trade practices. He took a hard stance on international agreements, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, while pressuring NATO allies to meet their financial commitments. He engaged in direct diplomacy with leaders of adversarial nations, including historic meetings with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Supporters credit him with standing up to economic competitors, renegotiating unfair deals, and pursuing peace through unconventional diplomacy. Critics argue that his unpredictability created instability, damaged long-standing alliances, and undermined diplomatic norms. Biden's administration has prioritized coalition building to address global threats such as climate change, cybersecurity, and authoritarian expansion. His approach to China focuses on economic competition while maintaining diplomatic engagement, and he has worked to strengthen partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region. He has also emphasized continued military and financial support for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. Supporters view his policies as a return to stable strategic leadership that reinforces American values. Critics argue that his approach is too cautious, fails to deter adversaries effectively, and places excessive trust in diplomatic processes. Their differing foreign policies continue to shape international relations and America's role in global affairs.